an old friend of mine, a retired federal and state civil rights executive, and also a managing partner of ADR. Second, Soumaya Khalifa, who is a specialist in culture and communication differences with a particular emphasis on Muslims in the workplace. Third, Simma Lieberman, who is the president of Simma Lieberman Associates and producer of the podcast, and I'm going to read it because I want to get it right. I love the title. Everyday Conversations on Race for Everyday People. Fourth, Joseph Nwoye, founder of Systemic Diversity and Inclusion, corporate consultant who is committed to finding solutions to both D&I and social justice, a topic we'll come back to tonight. And finally, Elwood Watson, professor of history, African American studies, and gender and sexuality studies at East Tennessee State University. I'll introduce myself. My name is Carlos Cortes. I'm professor emeritus of history at the University of California, Riverside, and currently co-director of our School of Medicine's curriculum in health equity, social justice, and anti-racism. So let's get rolling tonight. I hope you've all opened your chat rooms. Please do. I see someone has. I'd like to get all the chat rooms open because I'd like to make this as interactive an evening as we possibly can. You can post comments at any time, general questions, and get them out there. People are saying, hello, everyone. I want you to work harder than that, though. I want you to actually post something, okay, just to get us warmed up. What I'd like. When you hear the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, what crosses your mind? A word, a sentence, a question? What do you think? Who posted? Harmony. All right, dang, Carlos. Okay, I hope you don't think that. Anti-poverty. Yes, that's getting into the social justice and work. Okay.
Carlos, while they are doing that, taking a second to think, may I show the donors, the sponsors who have been.
You may do. Yep, you're the boss.
All right.
I'm watching.
So if Alana, you would allow me to do a screen share.
It's already available.
All right. So while everyone is thinking about this wonderful question, please take a look at the number and donors, people who have made this possible, made the American Diversity Report possible for the next coming year. And to thank all of you. It's a pleasure to have you support and join the American Diversity Report and to lend your name to our work. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. We will be publishing this on the American Diversity Report so that you can see it online also. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Okay, look at equal access diversity. Okay. All right. Yeah, I see everything running from diversity and equity to numbers to systemic. One even mentioned about not part of capitalism, belongingness, equal access to opportunities. In fact, people have weighed in on all kinds of issues which we're going to be addressing tonight. So I'd like to turn to the panel then and say, look, you've seen some of the responses, and you've been veterans in the field for quite some time. So would you, each of you, take 2 to 3 minutes, just reflecting either on what's in the chat room, on your own experiences, just reflect on the field of diversity as you see it, and on your own personal relationship to that field. So we're going to work from reverse alphabetical. Elwood's not with us yet, huh?
Yes, I am.
Ah, you are.
You're hiding.
You're hiding, no one behind your name.
My hand's right
Nobody
there.
can see. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So you want me to start?
Yes, you're the man.
Okay. Yeah. To me, diversity is, well, the word itself, diversity means a plethora. Multiculturalism. It means a variety of things in life. Diversity to me can mean race. It can mean gender. It can mean age. It can be level of education. It can be class. It can be economics. It could be sexual orientation. It could be religion. It could be all those things. To me, diversity can apply to all those dynamics. And I think diversity became a buzzword in the 1990s in a lot of places, and particularly in corporations and higher education where I'm at, probably in, various other aspects in the sports world and politics and, pretty much every avenue of American society and probably even globally. What I see primarily with diversity a lot of times to me is inclusion. It means representation. It also means progress. To me, I think that for the most part, diversity to me is a very progressive term. It means that you're willing to step outside the box. You're willing to explore new concepts. You're willing to get to move on from such a linear environment. And I think too many Americans, historically speaking, have been either resistant to diversity or at the very least indifferent toward diversity. They see it as something that they see it primarily with a race face, if I can use that term. They don't realize diversity, as I said earlier on in the conversation, can be age, it can be politics, it can be socioeconomics, it can be education, it can be a plethora of issues. And I think for the most part, the media and other places have kind of seen diversity as primarily hordes, these are my terms, hordes of minorities and people of color coming in wanting to displace whites and homogeneous populations and the dynamic. And that's simply not the case. Diversity is meaning listening to other people and tapping into other environments and learning from others. And that in itself is a form of education. It's just not, education is not the 3 R's. It's not reading, writing, and arithmetic. Education is learning other people, learning other cultures, learning other religions, different people from different backgrounds, different ages, different regions of the country. For example, you could also be white, you could also be Italian, you could also be black, white is Italian. You could also be of a certain race and other people and still have the same diversity. An example I would use is a white teenage male from Biloxi, Mississippi, a white teenage male from Boise, Idaho, and a white teenage male from Buffalo, New York. They're all white males. They all could be middle-class males, but they all still might have different life experiences given depending on the region they've lived in, maybe the types of foods that they're used to eating, maybe the type of, weather they're used to, or the type of, other things that are part of their particular communities. That way they can share with each other. Even though people have a tendency to lump black people and people of color together, black people are not monolithic. We're very, very diverse. I mean, you may take black Creoles in New Orleans, Louisiana. You could take black people who live in, New York City, in certain parts of New York City. You can take black people who lived in Los Angeles, for that matter. Take black people who live in Seattle, Washington. I mean, they could have very, very varied experiences. They all may be black, and they're all going to be dealing with race on some level, but the experience those individuals have had could still be vastly different. And I think we have to be very mindful of that sense. So to me, diversity means difference. It can also be similarities, but it can also be a common ground. So that to me, I think is how I see diversity. No one specific definition, but it's.
Well, thank you, Elwood. That's terrific. I thank you for the great kickoff. And now we're still working in reverse order. Joseph Nwoye, would you like to chime in? You have to unmute. No, Joseph, you need to unmute. Joseph, you need to unmute.
Unmute, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I think diversity and inclusion are very important terms. One which I think we need to try to distinguish. The former speaker mentioned names like what we call diversity may be in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, and other aspects of isms. However, there's a difference between diversity and inclusion. And the reason why we are having problem in area of diversity stems from the view that diversity is something we can always say, well, that's it. You can't get to people you never knew, you have never associated with. All of a sudden, you chum up with them, especially in this culture. So inclusion requires hard work, building relationship, trust. It's only when you build relationship and trust that you can use the term inclusion. That's when it suffices. Part of the reasons why most corporations fail in the area of diversity is because they don't look into how to build connection. Jamie, the president of JC Morgan Chase, once said that he hired all these people, all of a sudden they left. Well, they left because they came to work for him because they needed money, perhaps take care of their families. But they didn't feel a sense of belonging. So as soon as they found other jobs that could give them maybe not as much money, but they developed a sense of belonging, a sense of calmness, a sense that I like these people. These people are part of me. They are involved in meetings. They are not really marginalized. The other way I can put it is this way. If you invite people to a party, it's your responsibility to call them to dance. It's only when they get into dancing and grooving that the concept of inclusion sets in. Without that, they could sit down there and at the end, some people would go to people they know and they chat and they develop a sense of belonging, but some people are excluded. Thank you.
Thanks for moving us along. Simma, you going to pick up the baton?
Hi. Hi, I'm Simma. I'm in Berkeley, California. And I was thinking about, you asked us to reflect. And I was reflecting on all the years that I've been doing this work and the changes that I've seen. And I think it's really important to know history. I think it's really important to know history of diversity, equity, and inclusion for a lot of reasons. One, so that you don't make the same mistakes. Two, that you could build on the strengths. And three, so that you could speak to the history and look at what we need to do to go forward. When I first started doing this work, I've been doing this work now, it's been probably almost 30 years. And in the beginning, a lot of it was because companies were being sued. Companies were being sued, and at the same time, there were some organizations that did see the business case. They said, okay, this is why we need to do this. We need to think in terms of diversity. And they were thinking more in terms of representation. Some of it was there was the different ways of looking at it. On the one hand, people quoted often the idea that in a diverse organization, it's easier to solve problems. In a diverse organization, people are more creative. But that wasn't necessarily true, because studies showed that in diverse organization, if people don't know each other, they just stay isolated. They stay in their own little silos and they just live off their stereotypes. But it's when people know each other, when people connect with each other, that's when you have the creativity, that's when you have the great ideas. And that's really when you have inclusion, when people know each other. And in the beginning, when they were chief diversity officers, I remember Denny's got sued and for racism, and they had they decided to have a vice president of diversity, and she reported to the CEO. She sat at the same table as the CEO, and that was groundbreaking. And a lot of organizations in the beginning did that, although they still didn't see beyond representation. Then we started moving into inclusion. Like when I first started doing this work, I was doing training in diversity. Then we started talking about inclusion. We started talking about systemic change. And organizations started looking at systemic change. At the same time, people who were chief diversity officers, or people who were doing diversity, so to speak, were downgraded. They were no longer all sitting at the table with the CEO, but they were put in HR. They were put like in their own little compartment. They talk about changing the culture, but they didn't really change the culture. A lot of it was around, let's have a diversity potluck, let's do this event, let's do that event, let's have an ERG. All of these things, while they're really important, we're not talking about real systemic change. And I think it became easier to pigeonhole people in little boxes instead of looking at your overall system, looking at the business case and what organizations needed to do. And as a result of that, I think that what we started seeing is lawsuits again, but people leaving organizations because they didn't feel like they really belonged. Nobody was asking them. People were saying, hey, let's focus on numbers. Let's get all these people in there. But when people came in, there was no culture, no way of making people feel that they belong. People aren't necessarily listening to other people who are different. They were like, you need to come in here and then you have to come in and fit in with us. But we're not doing anything to really benefit from who you are. So as a result, people leave because they feel underestimated. They feel like, especially like for a lot of Black people come into an organization and then people don't ask their opinions. They rather don't even want to hear their opinions. So people think, well, why am I staying here? So they leave. And I'll finish up. I think that now we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we have more of an emphasis on equity. And for my main reflection now, it's how do we integrate diversity, equity, inclusion? How do we integrate the idea of the inequities that we see, all the inequities? How do we make everybody feel included so that we benefit from everybody in the organization? So we have to integrate the business case, the organizational case with what's actually going on in society on the outside. And what that also means then is that people need to talk to each other. We need to be able to have those conversations. We need to work on 4 levels. We need to work on the individual level, the interpersonal level, the organizational level, and the environmental level. And so that's why it's so exciting to have all of these people here. And with that, we can move to the next person.
And we're going to move right on to Soumaya. There you go. You're ahead of the game.
Hello, everyone. This is Soumaya from Atlanta, Georgia. It's such an honor and pleasure to be with you all. Speaking about such an important topic. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is such a journey. It's not a check the box and as an organization, I've got it made. Even the best of the best, there's still ways for them to go. In terms of definition of diversity, it's all the ways that we are similar and different. And I loved what John said in terms of diversity is people being invited to a party. Inclusion is for them to be asked to dance at the party. And belonging is for them to go to the DJ and ask the DJ to play their favorite song. And I agree with Simma so much in terms of, the Coca-Cola company. About 15 years ago, there was a class action lawsuit against it where African Americans were not being promoted and were not being hired at the same rate that their white counterparts were. And the class action lawsuit made the Coca-Cola company, as part of their settlement, to have a very dynamic diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. And it's still going until this day. And in terms of the business case, I'm a strong believer that for diversity, equity, and inclusion to be successful in any organization, it needs to be in their DNA. Very much similar to how organizations treat safety. How do they do DEI in recruitment, in retention, in promotion, all those things, and the opportunities. But also, what kind of culture do they have? Back to what Simma said, bringing in people of color into an organization, and if the organization is not welcoming of them, then they're going to move on. And I think John said that. They will find another place, another employer who would hire them where the culture fits the person. So it is a business case. It is a very strong business case because within the United States, our demographics have changed tremendously over the last 20 years. It's no longer just black and white. It's no longer just men and women. There's so many different layers of diversity that employers and organizations need to be looking into. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Soumaya. And Mark, last man up. Unmute, buddy.
Thank you, Carlos. What's fresh in my mind tonight is a conversation I had with a colleague this morning who works with people who have been traumatized, trauma victims, active duty military and veterans. And the point she was making is that the whole country is in a state of trauma right now, and that that trauma needs to be dealt with, and trauma exists, you know, not just in one group or another group, but a great many people have had trauma in their lives, and that has to be dealt with. And when she tries to deal with these issues, she gets a lot of pushback. And one of the things we were talking about was the pushback that's come from the president's executive order last week, with very anti-diversity. So there are a large number of people in the country who have experienced trauma, and a lot of people in the country who are not inclined to be positive about diversity when they hear diversity discussions. And so how to integrate all of those people into the discussion too. What I've noticed from years of working on the civil rights enforcement side of this field is that we tend to spend a lot of time talking with people who tend to agree with us, and not a whole lot of time talking and especially listening to people who are not inclined to agree with us. And yet, if we do listen, we'll discover that a great many people have trauma that they're presently experiencing or that they've experienced in the past. And so how to use that old-fashioned term, integrate them into this discussion.
Oh, great, Mark. Some fascinating stuff. By the way, listening to the five of you and then also reading the chat room has just exploded. It's been fabulous. Raised a number of issues. So let me move from something so far, the discussion so far has been something I often hear referred to in diversity world as admiring the problem. That you talk about the problem over and over and over. The question is, how do you move forward on it? So throwing out, I see Rachel Hicks posted something, a question earlier about organizations are comfortable with equity and inclusion, not so much with social justice idea. Mark has raised the question of trauma, getting some pushback on that. So my question is this, what strategies have the five of you found to be effective in breaking through against some of these obstacles and pushbacks that you find in organizations? Because I think everybody out there in the audience would probably like to say, yeah, what works? So let's not admire the problem any longer. Let's talk about how we push forward. So I'd love to hear in a minute or so, a couple strategies that work for some of you to break through on some of these issues. Who feels like going first?
I'll go first. This is Soumaya.
Soumaya, great.
You know, diversity has to be from the top down. The diversity champion needs to be the highest possible person in organization. And they need to let the organization that is part of doing business, and that they will be held accountable to do diversity and inclusion. And they have to walk the walk. They can't just say, hey, diversity inclusion, let's check the box. We have all these people here, you know, how many whites, how many African Americans, how many, et cetera, et cetera. How do they walk the walk? How do they create the culture? How do they retain these people? How do they make these people feel that they belong to this organization, that they want to give 110%? That's the real test.
All right. Simma, I see you shaking your hand.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that we have to go even deeper, because I agree that if because when we first started doing this work, let me just say, I remember people would get like these huge training contracts, and the CEOs would say, that's for the employees. Now, in the beginning, I didn't understand systems, so I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll make all this money, it sounds good. But the reality is that there was no change, because the CEOs would say, this is just the employees, they need this. And then employees would leave, employees would come, but there was no change. I agree that it has to happen at the top. And the part of the vision of the top is it can't stay stuck at the top, because sometimes it also stays stuck at the top. It has to be a whole strategy for integrating the whole organization, getting everybody involved, getting everybody engaged, and not just like the woke people, but for people to see that it's all in their interest together, and organizations have to be able to create communities. One last thing that I want to say is that something a lot of people have been way ahead of the curve on this than me, but I'm really understanding the need for internal transformation, that people need to transform internally. The CEO, the leadership has to be willing to transform themselves. So it's part of their DNA. And that's how we also have to continue it down the organization to make it the whole organization's DNA.
Okay, good. Mark, yeah.
Yeah, well, one of the few things I've seen that works is from contact theory, and that is people working, going to school together, spending time together on a one-on-one basis. I found that organizational culture change is pretty much one of the most difficult things there is to do, but you can arrange for people to have experiences, and then through those experiences, hopefully they'll experience some of that spiritual, that inner transformational change that Simma was mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'd like to mention
I got
something.
Okay.
Add something to what Mark has said. As a former urban planner, let's understand that the isolation of communities has been built into our society for a very long time, and the ability to meet others, to engage in different communities has not been there. And we have remarkably asked people who have been isolated to suddenly engage with people unlike themselves, and then we're surprised that it doesn't go well. But the reality is that it can, but it does take time. And it does take overcoming some biases, both direct and unconscious, because there has not been the interface in the past. There's only been the hearsay in many cases. And so we have quite a lot of work to do, not just in the corporate world, but in the communities, our cities, ourselves, where people grow up in schools and they just never meet the people who they hope to someday work with. And we are going to need to concentrate on that so much more, especially now with the trauma and the fear and the disorganization that we're experiencing. Maybe it's also, though, an opportunity to address it more closely. Thank you.
Yeah, I got a question.
Was someone ready to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, Elwood.
Oh, Elwood, okay.
Yeah, I think excellent points that have been made thus far. I would argue that as someone in academia, yes, I think that it has to come from the top on down. And I think somebody made an excellent point there, and Simma made some very good points as well. I was talking to a friend of mine who teaches at another institution. He's about to retire. He was older than me, but in New England. And he was asking me about, they were having problems recruiting, this was in New Hampshire, and they had problems recruiting students of color there. They wanted to know, well, you know, what they wanted to, how to handle this. And I think it has to start from the top on up, as I said on myself. I think for so long, what happened in academia was there was such a push to get students of color to come to campus and things like that as well. And that's good. And that's something to be important. I said, but you might want to start by having more Black administrators. You might want to start by having more faculty people there and stuff as well. I said, but people come to campus, when students come to these places, they're going to see people who look like them on campus, and they might feel, well, then I have somebody to go talk to, or I have somebody I can relate to on some level. As again, as I said, not all people of color are monolithic, but by and large, it's going to certainly be reassuring. because there is a commonality in experiences. Every Black person in this country, every Muslim person, every Asian person, every non-white person in this country, or every woman in this country on some level or at some point in their life, if they have not, they're going to experience racism or sexism of some sort. So the reality is there is going to be the experience there. And to me, I think, why would a kid come? I tell them, why is a kid going to come from, let's say, Tennessee or Missouri, California, Georgia? Why would they come to a school in central New Hampshire when they get to campus and see nobody like them, if they have other options? I mean, why would they? What's going to make them really? What's going to sell them to come here? Now, if they see Black administrators, they see administrators of color, regardless of their race, faculty, they see their Black faculty on the staff at the institution. That's going to be a factor. I think, yes, it has to start from the top on down. It is crucial that there's going to have to be a commitment from the CEO or the president of an institution to implement. Yes, diversity is going to be crucial. It's going to be a part of our mission. It's going to be implemented in all aspects of the school, from the top on down, to the colleges, to the provost's office, to the dean's office of every college, to the VPs, the provost, associate provost offices, all the way down to the chairs, the associate deans. All has to be a trickle down effect to every single area. And I think it's a lot easier for new corporations when they start off, whether startup companies or places like that as well. It is crucial to implement those policies from the very, very beginning on the front end, because it's going to be much easier to do those things on the front end than it is later on. I think when you do those things on the front end, it is much easier to let the people know this is going to be a part of the company. It's in our DNA, and it's going to have to start. But I do think it has to start from the top on down. And also, I think for new companies and new places starting off, it is crucial that they start from the very beginning to implement diversity initiatives and an environment where diversity is going to be saturated within that culture, because it's much easier to do that on the front end, I think, as opposed to when time goes along.
That's a good point. I had an experience just last week when a university, a dean contacted me and said students were going through trauma because of all the events. Would I be willing to do a Zoom meeting with with a number of students? And my response to him is, yes, I'll do it, but only if you're there. And
perfect, exactly.
He said yes, and he came. Where it goes, but I think diversity people are going to have to be courageous in turning down gigs that are not going the direction you think are really going to help folks. So I want to ask a little tougher question here. So many people in the chat room and some of you speaking out there have brought about inclusion, connections, linkages, things of this sort. So I want to turn that on its head. One of the things you hear a lot about these days is a thing called cancel culture, and its impact on the willingness of people to be honest, to talk, for fear of saying the wrong things, for fear of using the wrong group names, for fear of being accused of causing trauma. And I'm hearing more and more from diversity people, and I'm running into it myself, where people just won't talk. They just clam up. So my question is, how can we as diversity people actually encourage and not discourage healthy, connecting conversations? Because I have to be honest, as a trainer of diversity people, I have watched a number of diversity trainers who shut people up, who actually cause conversations to die as part of their diversity training. So my question is, how do you break through this and make connections?
I can start.
I see some kids going. I'll get to you, Elwood. You just talk. I want to try and get everyone who hasn't spoken. Simma, you were shaking your head. You better unmute.
I was one of those people when I was really young that used to shut people down. And a friend of mine at the time, this is when I was young, maybe in my 20s. And a friend of mine who was African American, I was doing my thing of, I'm the good white person, I'm going to shut you down. And my friend said to me, he said, you got to stop. I said, what do you mean? And he said, you have to look at this as it's a war. He said, and you have to think about this in terms of imagine that you're a Black person imagine you're a slave running away from the plantation during slavery, or that you're running away from the concentration camps during the Holocaust. he said, what do you want people to do? Do you want to alienate people so they turn you in? Or do you want to try to make friends and at least have people neutralize people and maybe even hide you out? You want to win them over. And that had an impact on me all these years. And I thought about that. And that got me to stop being that person that shut people down. And what I found is that as consultants, a lot of it is up to us, how we lead the conversation, how we make a safe place for people to talk, and how we set up the conversation and let people know that, you know, you may make mistakes and we're here to help, but make it okay for people to talk. And I'm not talking about people who are just like stone racists, you know, that's what they do. But for people who might not know what to say. And I think it's important for us to be able to create community. And you know what? Like I tell people, I may be perfect now, but I wasn't always perfect. So somebody must have helped me, you know? So for all of us, is think about what was our journey? How did we get where we are? You know, how did we become like maybe not homophobic? How did we become like less racist, whatever it was? And so we have to be willing to help other people on the journey, because for me, we need people, we need everybody. And I don't believe that we could afford to throw somebody away for something that they said 20 years ago. On the other hand, I do want to know how people have changed, what their process was, because we need to help other people change too.
You know, there's such a perfect
Soumaya,
example. Thank you so much for sharing your story, because one of the things that I found to be very, very impactful is for people who perceive each other to be different, to sit down over a cup of coffee or lunch or something and talk about who they are in a safe space. And whether a person is straight, or whether a person is gay, whether a person is this or that, but sitting down over a cup of coffee and talking and connecting on the human level. It always fascinates me how these two people having conversation really connect, and they're no longer the stereotype of, you know, she's a Muslim or he's a Jew, or you know, he's straight, he's gay, he's black, he's white, whatever, but connecting on a human level and finding the commonalities goes a long way. Back to what Dr. Joseph said earlier, the relationship building, again, is very, very crucial.
Right. I got a question. I want to jump in from David Grinberg. He says, Elwood, I particularly I'd like you to think about this one. He said, how much do ethnic studies programs in academia help improve DEI on campus and employment? Elwood, you're in African American studies now. I was the chair of a Chicano studies program. So they toss the ball in our court. Let's go for it.
Yeah, as somebody who's served as a interim chair of African American Studies Department, as also an associate chair of the History Department, I think that it is very crucial that ethnic studies be taught. And I've written about these lately as well. Just a quick thing on cancel culture, since we were talking about that briefly. I am working on an article on cancel culture right now that I'll be sending to Deborah, American Diversity Report in the near future. So look out for it, Deborah. I'll be getting sure. So I have my opinions on cancel culture and viewpoints, and I think it's primarily to me, it's, and I'll leave it here, but I want people to read it first. I don't want to talk about the article, otherwise you won't read it. Why talk about something I'm not going to be right about. So therefore, it's going to be primarily, I think it's a matter of whose ox is being gored, and whether it's left or right, and we'll leave it there, as well. So that's to give you an idea to think. Now, as far as ethnic studies, to respond to Mr. Grinberg's question, yes, I think ethnic studies is very crucial in our society now more than ever, because what happens is, I think Deborah made a very excellent points previously. A lot of students, particularly if they come in homogeneous environments, and we do live in a very segregated society, for the most part, by and large, residentially, and economically, and other ways as well. And for example, I teach at East Tennessee State University here in Johnson City, Tennessee. East Tennessee is a very homogeneous area for the most part. The Black population is relatively small. The Hispanic population is even smaller. Southwestern Virginia, again, the same thing, not a large number of people of color in these areas, Western Carolina. So these kids come to college and they come to a campus. The only exposure they've had with people of color, there might have been 1 or 2 blacks in their high school, if that many. And the only exposure they get is from TV, maybe whether it's, I don't know if it's MTV or what do they get now, you know, videos, or what their exposure to music and pop culture in general. So a lot of them come to campus, you know, already preloaded with stereotypes, but also a segment of them that are very, very hungry to learn about other cultures and other dynamics. What I do in my classes is class participation is considerably in all my classes a very significant part of their grade, particularly upper level and graduate seminars. So therefore, they're mandatory that they speak. That way, because it shows me whether they've read the material or not, first of all, and if they understand it. So therefore, they're inclined to, they have to be able to speak and interact. And I'll call on students directly, so-and-so, what do you think about this? So-and-so, what do you think about that? You know, so-and-so. I put them in groups, I have them debate situations, you know, so-and-so, these two individuals, group one, you debate this, group two, you debate this. You know, I do a stereotype, I do a seminar on stereotypes. Each section of my class and my ethnic studies and courses, there's always a class period where we talk about stereotypes. So I put them in groups and have them make a list of stereotypes of each group. Whether it's, you know, okay, you're responsible to look at stereotypes concerning whites. You're responsible for stereotypes concerning African Americans. You're responsible for stereotypes concerning Asians. You're responsible for stereotypes concerning Arabs. You know, and so on. You know, you're LGBTQ. So they get together and they'll come by. Well, I don't really I said, I just write down the stereotypes. I said, there's not an issue about, you know, I want you to be blunt and honest. Okay. So, and I expect candor. And pretty much they, some of the students are a little nervous, but they realize, here are the stereotypes that I've heard about, And I think in that sense, you've got to kind of be hands-on and throw people into the mix and say, you're going to have to participate in this. I want candid and honest. My philosophy is this: let people know where you stand. I don't believe in dancing around the issues, and I don't believe in being, you know, speaking in double speak when it comes to dealing with diversity. Here's what you think. Why do you think this way? And I tell students, they know I'm very candid in my class, so a lot of them feel comfortable speaking honestly and tell me, yo, well, my father or my uncle is a doctor and he does have these racist opinions and and all this kind of stuff, and he feels black people don't eat properly and all this kind of stuff. Well, I mean, I'd rather hear that, and then as opposed to being, oh, well, you know, being what I hate these terms, politically correct or whatever. Here's what I think about these issues. Let me know what you think, whether it's a racist opinion or not, and let's go from there. Because to me, I think once people are out and what they really think, it's much easier to understand. When you let people know where you're coming from, to use that old saying. You know, let people know where you're coming from. And I think it's a lot easier once people are honest and blunt. You may not like what they say, but at least they're honest and they're candid and they let you know what they really feel. And we can go from there. I think it's a lot easier once you know where people stand, as opposed to have to second guess people or dancing around the issues that really, as I think Simma and Soumaya was saying earlier, those kind of things don't really get things done. You're back to square one again when people are dancing around issues and being correct. Then when the next meeting, somebody's going to call you again, as you said, Carlos, can you help me with this project? And then 3 years down the road, can you help me with this project? People are leaving and I think you got to be candid and get it out there and go from there.
Well, thank you. Following up on David's question, Elwood mentioned moving just away from ethnic studies. I like this particularly for Joseph and Mark, but everybody can jump in after that. How do we know we're doing any good?
Well,
how do we know we're doing any good? What is the way of, how do we know?
right.
Mark, Joseph?
Yeah, that's the broader version of the question about the efficacy of DEI programs in academia, is the efficacy of DEI programs generally. What I found in studying this and writing on the topic have done any good. Most of what masquerades as evaluation is things like happiness indexes or change in attitude, as opposed to actually improving statistics quantitatively on the ground in the organization. And one of the examples that I give is that when I look at corporations that win awards in diversity, I find that about 80% of those corporations have very undiverse executive teams, which gets back to the discussion we were having before about diversity starting from the top. I'd like to add one thing on the cancel culture question, which also gets to what's called deplatforming, you know, removing people from social media. I'm not much of an enthusiast for that because I regard those things as a form of censorship. And I worry about censorship because today I censor you because you say something I don't like, and tomorrow you censor me. And pretty soon we're both silent.
Exactly.
Yeah. Joseph, thank you, Mark. And we're going to come back to what types of metrics can we come back to. Joseph, want to unmute yourself? Want to unmute? Unmute. Joseph, unmute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now, yes, we can.
Okay, before I go to that question, I want to go to the first question he asked because it's very important. I had Mark mention trauma, and I had someone else mention leadership. Well, we fail to understand that the foundational aspect of isms is because of the walls, artificial walls, what I call artificial walls in my book, that demarcate people on this side, acculturate people within this side to think of people on the other side in a very negative way. Then if we go into psychology and development of our schema, it's ingrained so deep in the minds of people. And the thing goes both ways. So when you see people from different environment, people all of a sudden expect them to chum up. It doesn't work that way. There's a book titled, Why Are Black People Sitting in Cafeteria Alone? I can't remember the name of the author, which goes into the fact that every one of us could go and sit in the cafeteria depending on whom we go to. You go to people whom you can associate with. So through that process, we get into what Mark referred to as trauma. Because when you come to an environment where you feel like you don't belong, and the activities clearly point to the fact that they don't want to include you, you don't have choice but to begin to develop those type of sources. So as to how do you develop that? Again, in my book, I demarcated into two parts. Belief formation process stems from the fact that we've socio-cultured people to be different, to act differently, to actually be negative to some people. And so to overcome that, I came with this belief formation that instructs people that you don't blame people for who they are. Because we all, our parents, our relatives, our brothers and sisters, the community in which we live. And for me, I take my parents as an example. I can't think of a better parents than them. They grew me well. And I don't believe there's anything they said to me that I would act in contrary to. So by the same token, whether you're white or black, you've been social cultured, especially in this environment where you are demarcated in terms of class, in terms of race, in like 1954 case, Topeka versus Board of Education, all those things are reversed significantly. So the point I do emphasize goes back to what I've had. When you come to transforming that belief, which had been, people been shaped to be what they are, you have to create a forum where the engagement I've had everyone talking about becomes necessary. And it has to be honest engagement. It's not quick thing, like most things, like microwave. It doesn't work that way. You have to really begin to go deep, create trust. The level of trust you create will be determinant of how do you get to know them meaningfully. Not when you ask, how are you doing? I'm fine. No, you don't have any idea how the person feels. You have to go deeper. And when you begin to get to that, they begin to go forward. And for people who may feel like reverse, well, that could be felt by people who see that things are going the other way around. And that's why it's incumbent upon trainers, diversity trainers, to understand that human beings feel differently depending on how you develop it. You don't divorce certain belief system because they don't fit into your own. Say, for instance, now, if somebody say, I don't like black people, all of a sudden you meet black people that you begin to know them, all of a sudden it transforms. That's where transformation takes place. Until we begin to do the real work, I don't think we're gonna make any dent. We have to do it.
Joseph, you raised an important point. You use the words honest engagement. And so let me pick up on that. We all know the name George Floyd. And we all know what's happened since the death of George Floyd. There's been rebirth of the anti-racism movement. This is not new. We had it in the 60s and early 70s, and it sort of died out with multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion. Now anti-racism is back on the front page. And I'm hearing from organizations constantly, we need to build anti-racism into what we're doing. So my question to all of you, the 5 panelists, is how has the George Floyd's death and the aftermath affected your particular diversity work in terms of anti-racism? And how would you respond if an organization called you and said, how should we respond to the death of George Floyd and the anti-racism movement, which has developed since then? So, take it away, any of the 5 of you.
Yeah,
Mark, you're on.
two-part answer. My personal professional response was to do work on reducing police violence and write a paper that Deborah has published, and it's been published a couple other places, on concrete recommendations, very concrete recommendations on reducing police violence. Nothing feel good, kumbaya, just, real hardcore stuff on how to really reform police and reduce violence. The second half, in terms of organizations that newly want to get involved in anti-racism, I don't think there are any quick fixes, and I certainly don't think that a kind of a ritualistic or formulaic statement issued by a CEO is the answer. I think that the diversity and inclusion work is part of a spectrum of work in this field, including looking at other organizations in the field, benchmarking, looking at ground level statistics, having good non-discrimination policies and practices, all the old things and all the new things too, like equal employment opportunity and non-discrimination and affirmative action. All of these things, having good policies and procedures for grievances and complaints, that all of these things have to be done, and then hopefully they will contribute to anti-racism.
Okay, good. Who else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, Simma.
Well, I think that when it comes to looking at racism, we have to look at it from a systemic point and also from a people point, because people create systems, but at the same time, systems perpetuate racism, and this is historical. For my own thing, what I've been doing is I have my podcast on race, which is Everyday Conversations on Racism. We talked about it, where I bring people together to have real conversations on race. It's not intellectual, it's not academic. I mean, it could be, I tell people, I said I could be, but I choose not to be. But we get people to actually talk. And a lot of people say, I never heard these kinds of conversations before, and it changes how I think. So I think we need to change people, and people need to change systems, but we can't work on one without working on the other. I think that it really is important to look at issues around police violence. And at the same time, we got to get people, we do have to have people talking to each other. And I have to say, since everything happened, people who didn't want to talk to me months ago when I was talking about race, particularly white people, all of a sudden are calling me up, which is, I'm not complaining about that at all, because I'm glad that people are calling me. I'm glad people do want to do something. And I hope it continues, but a lot of my work has been now around like listening. People are bringing me in to be part of teams, because I like teams. I'm part of several multicultural teams where we are listening to employees, bringing people together, getting people to talk. But like Mark, it's not just one answer. This has to be done on like everything people do. I mean, something has to be done every day, in every way, every system, every conversation. And we all have a responsibility, and we all have a role, and there's not just one answer. And I think a lot of people are spending too much time looking for one answer, and when you do that, it's a way of having no answers and doing nothing.
You know, Simma, that's funny. I'm working with the city now in terms of developing their anti-racism statement, and the group of people who got together to write it split completely over those who said it's got to start with the individual, and those that it's got to start with the system. It almost blew up because they couldn't compromise. So I ended up with a statement saying anti-racism begins everywhere, and
I love that.
It's got to start at various.
I used to be one of those people. I mean, I used to be very dogmatic. And I was like, no, you only have to work on, no, you only have to do this. And then finally, I don't know what transformed me. Somebody hit me over the head with something. and that's why I said, it's just like what you said. It has to begin everywhere. And everybody has to do something. And it's good if we could have an overall strategy. And meanwhile, we can't wait.
Yeah.
Soumaya, you look like you wanted in.
Yeah. You know, a couple of things. Being an anti-racist and we wait until people are adults, that's just way too late. Their unconscious biases have been baked in and baked in and baked in. We need to, as a country and as a society, step back and look at all our systems, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's the judiciary system, whether it's whatever. And there is systemic racism in each one of these. Even when we had, you know, the coronavirus, we thought that's going to be an equalizer, right? It's going to be equal throughout, but we find out from the data that more people of color have been, you know, have died because of it, because they can't get the health care, the awareness is lower, etc. So we are seeing this over and over again. It needs to be, as a country, take this issue, and then we have people from all over the world, as societies and countries, we need to step back and take a very, very serious look at how to be anti-racist. It's not, again, not just at the workplace, but everywhere where we have that disease, if you will.
Soumaya, you threw another factor into the mix tonight when you mentioned COVID-19. We haven't talked about that yet, so I want to toss this out. In your own work, the five of you, and how has COVID-19 affected your diversity work? And number two, how do you think that is going to change diversity work going forward?
I would argue that, this is Elwood, I would argue that the COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact, not just here in the United States, but I would even say globally. And I would say that I want to take off what Soumaya just said a few minutes ago because she made some excellent points. It also has to look at the dynamics. When George Floyd situation came out horrendous, and just more recently with Jacob Blake and stuff, it seems like we always get these statements, particularly George Floyd. I think it was just this type. I think we were at the height of the COVID was going on at that point, and I think people were just had a lot of time because they couldn't go to work. They were inside watching TV or whatever, and it was something they were able to consume at a much higher rate than they may normally had. I think had it not been for this COVID-19, the pandemic, I think people looked at it and may shake their head and said, "Oh, this is awful," and it kind of would have been business as usual 2 or 3 days. But I think there was such a environmental factor. People were hunkered down in their homes and their apartments and whatever, saw this, and they just saw this over and saw such a sadistic act taking place in front of their eyes that they could not ignore. I mean, there are people who tried to justify it and said, well, he had asthma and all that, right-wing websites and stuff like that as well. But I think it was a spark there that people saw that and said, this is ridiculous, because it was right off the heels of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, which is still, these type of dynamics, which is over and over again. You couldn't pick up the paper, turn on the television, but every week there was some Black person being murdered, at the hands of law enforcement. So I think it got to the point where people said, we have to look at this and see there's a major problem here, and it is systemic. And I think as well. And I think corporations, this is not to say that they should not donate money to causes. By all means, that is certainly good. But, that is pennies for what these corporations make, okay? Whether it's McDonald's or whether it's Nestle or whether it's Pepsi or whether it's Coca-Cola, donating, $20 million, $30 million, that's all in good, but that's pennies for what these corporations make, so that's all in good. But they need to go beyond that. I think as well, it has to look into the economic aspects of racism, because racism, that's where the systemic and systematic racism comes into place. More Black CEOs, more Black training companies, internships for Black kids or people from disadvantaged backgrounds, or Asian kids or Latino kids. That's where you have to look at it. It has to be, again, a trickle-down effect where we're going to have internship programs. I think reparations, even though that hasn't been talked about tonight too much, I think that should be on the table. And I think it would, but I think those kind of dynamics have to come in. We have to look at, systemic ways to fight systemic and racism. Symbols are important. Don't get me wrong, I understand the powers of symbolism, but I wrote an article for Public Seminar not too long ago. All that is good, but taking down a statue here or a monument there and all that at the end of the day is not gonna really solve the problem. Okay, that might make people feel temporarily psychologically feel good, but you're still going to have that racial issues there if we don't start addressing things that are much more systemic and directly impact people's lives on a daily basis. And a statue is not going to do that. Okay.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on how COVID-19 has influenced what you're doing?
I'd like to say something about that.
Okay, Deborah.
I've had more requests for proposals in the past month or so than I've had in a decade. And one of the things that has come up in just about every case is an understanding that what has been done in the past simply is either not working or obsolete, irrelevant, however you want to call it. And then they want to know, how do we move forward? Many of them have expressed a frustration, perhaps impatience, with their current HR department and wanting to do something very, very different. They don't know exactly what. They ask me, okay, what should we do? And one of the things that I have used, a couple of things. One is my background in urban planning so that I plan. It is not just a sense of conversation or of good feelings. Another one is that I look more closely at how I can apply some of the work in neuroscience to adjust people's way of thinking. Because that is going to be something I think that will be key. They know something is wrong. They don't know quite what. They don't know what to think. And it needs a reboot of the neural network to really adjust for what is coming, what has happened, but what is also coming. And that, I think, is going to be key. In many ways, the chaos theory tells us that the most creative place in the universe is at the edge of chaos. And I do believe that's where we are.
Okay. A little Mark Rothko ending. Okay. Something just came up on chat room. I want to jump into. You don't lose it. From Judith Francis. I see Soumaya gave a big yes to it. I'll just read it. K-12 students. K-12 students need to be given the proper education, then the other levels of education. There's a battle going on right now at the K-12 level. I'm involved in one in the state of California where a bill has just been passed by the state legislature to mandate ethnic studies as a graduation requirement. And there is also a ethnic studies model curriculum, which the state is building, which is in all sorts of controversy. So my toss out to you, the five panelists, what would you recommend at the K-12 level to move us in the kinds of directions we've been talking about here?
Yeah, this hooks into the pandemic discussion because right now, students everywhere are suffering by being forced to participate in mediocre distance education. But the students who are suffering the most are students with disabilities and limited English proficient students and African-American students and Hispanic students who don't have good internet connections at home. So the pandemic has made things a lot worse. So before we recommend a whole lot of sophisticated stuff to do in K-12 education, I think we first need to fill the potholes and meet the needs of the students in education. For example, in the discussion of diversity, the word hasn't even come up tonight. We almost always, in fact, leave out people with disabilities. And yet those are some of the folks who are suffering the most. The needs of students with disabilities in K-12 education have never been fully met. Congress has never fully funded the requirements. Similarly, there are federal laws, and some states have laws about limiting those proficient students. Their needs have not been met. So in terms of big structural needs, we need to fill those needs. And then when we fill those needs of real students on the ground, then I think we can move on to working on more sophisticated stuff.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for bringing this very important point. It's on the ground, and you're absolutely right. My comment is post-COVID, hopefully soon. You know, all the textbooks, most of the textbooks that our students use in K through 12 in public school and anywhere else is very, very much white-centric. The African-American history is not there. It is from a perspective of white America. And if students are taught early on the total history of a country, when they learn about US history, for instance, I think that will make a big dent in terms of raising that awareness about diversity, about people who are different. They're not who they might think they are or are thinking that they are now, by bringing that history in.
If I may respond to some of the question, I would like to go back to what you said about George Floyd, because I think that George Floyd has provided people a common lens through which they will see the things African Americans have seen for years. Former Attorney General Eric Holder indicated that his dad had to tell him how to behave in certain locations just for being a black boy. His granddad told his dad the same thing, and he had to tell his son the same thing. This is a way for me to say that we have a systemic problem, and it's in every facet of our society, whether it's in school or in corporations or wherever it is. So if you look at the police, sometimes I make the point that police actually is being used as a scapegoat, and we cannot deal with systemic problem with non-systemic solution. We have to devise systemic solution in order to match the systemic problem we have. So regardless of where you are looking at it, we have to first understand that is a systemic problem, then begin to frame it the way it should be done. I've had people say president or cooperative leader, some of them don't have a clue of what it is because they're a reflection of the environment in which they were shaped. Now, COVID, what it did, it was that it gave a common lens through which white and brown and black people see the evil of racism and discriminatory practices. That's why you see black and white demonstrating. And as people say, for every turbulence, you see the good as well as the bad of it. So his Freud's death has given people who never saw these things, except the painful experience some people may have seen because of their closeness to it, gave people a new lens through which they see. Then when they see it, black and white, they say, no, we don't want this. That's why you see collection of everyone looking at it. So I would like to begin to frame it in terms of systemic. I had a program for police chiefs just recently, and it was unbelievable. We had police chief who indicated that he had been trained in Germany, and in Germany, when you get into training, you have it for at least 2.5 years. It provides them the opportunity to get into Nazi and the impact to Jewish people. In some locations, 93% of the Jewish people were killed. So police were acculturated into understanding this history. So when they go into operation, they keep it in mind. Now, contrast it to the United States. We have what they call state right and whatnot, where a state can actually decide to train their police force for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it may be. They don't really train people on that. But the point I'm trying to make is that depending on how you've been groomed, people say that African Americans are scared of police. Well, if you've seen the number of people being killed and you put yourself in their shoes for a moment, wouldn't you be scared? So if that's the case, we have to train police to understand that they may see somebody running. It doesn't mean that the person committed a crime. It may be because the social infrastructure of the society has been cultivated in the minds of that person. Oh, you better run. So the person is running, and the police may think, oh, the person did something he or she did not do, and act based on that. So it's really important that we begin to look at this thing in much more holistic terms as a systemic problem.
Excellent point. I think that's very important in that, yes, this is Elwood. You have to look at that in a sense because people are products of their life experiences. And yes, if you're an African American, particularly where class can come into play, probably African Americans in areas where lower income communities, where police officers have always been seen as an adversarial force as opposed to a complementary force, people are going to be more inclined to be suspicious of the police and resist the police on some level. I think we kind of saw that with Jacob Blake. What I saw with that particular situation was when he was walking to his car, he was walking away from the officers. Everything I saw, he had no weapons. He had nothing to, no evidence that he was going to do harm to these individuals. They tried to say he had a knife in his car, and come to find out, but I mean, I doubt if he was going to use the knife. I think he was going to get in his car and get ready to go away because I don't think he wanted anything to do with those police officers. He just wanted to, de-escalate the situation. They're the ones who escalated. But yes, I think that's highly important. Back to the COVID and the ethnic studies. Yes, Mark makes some very, very good points in regards to we need to certainly take care of the fundamental and fill the potholes and the basics as well, and then begin to implement more sophisticated methods. However, when I was in elementary school, we did have what we call social studies. So social studies did look at different areas and things as well. It was pretty much Eurocentric, the curriculum, but we could do that at the elementary school level. I mean, we can certainly do that as well. And we can certainly implement ethnic studies at the very level as well. So there's no difficulty in making that a possibility. There's got to be a willingness to do that. Right now, I think in some cases it's been a resistance as opposed to any kind of willingness to do that. So we can do that because we implement courses all the time in social studies and civics and those type of things as well at every level. So we have history and U.S. history and ethnic studies in school. So it's just we can implement those things at every level and put in curriculum that are appropriate for that particular grade level. Okay, I don't expect 10th graders, high school sophomores to be studying the same thing as first or second graders or even third graders, but we still can implement ethnic studies at various levels. So I don't think that's going to be too much of a problem.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you brought in social studies as an author of a social studies series being used nationally. I'm glad we recognize that. Let me come in a couple of things. We've talked about lots of different groups that make up diversity. One we haven't talked about is the transgender community, which has become suddenly erupted onto the scene in the last 10 years as a discussion. The question I want to pose to you is not about transgender. What do you think, as experts, might be the next group to sort of pop above the level of the water? What diversity group do you think you see in the future that hasn't received much attention and that might? So I may be grooving this for you, but so I'm going to start with you. Okay.
Great. I appreciate that. So one thing in terms of a diversity layer that is not brought into the workplace is that of faith traditions, a religion. There is a certain fear from employers to bring the conversation about religion into the workplace, which in my, from my standpoint, I believe that's a big mistake, because religion and faith traditions are people's moral compass. And when we talk about organizations' values, etc., it would be very strong to tie the values to whatever, values their employees have. Also, they need to know about the different faith traditions to be able to accommodate them, because that they have to provide reasonable accommodations. And when they don't do that, they get in trouble. It's very surprising for me every time I go into a workplace and talk about Muslims in the workplace and talk about their belief system and what are the reasonable accommodations. And a lot of the managers, supervisors, etc., will just be there and say, we had no idea. We thought whenever somebody told me that we had to go pray, we just let them go pray. Well, no, there is a window of opportunity. And you don't have to give them extra time in addition to their breaks. So organizations need to be empowered to understand different faith traditions that employees follow and how to leverage that to the best possible way for their organization.
You know, Soumaya, that's an interesting point. I teach cultural competency in medical care, and one of the examples I constantly use is during Ramadan, you don't give antibiotic series that has to be taken all day long with food to a Muslim. You use only antibiotics can be taken before sunrise or after sunset. Little thing like that, if you don't address religion.
If possible, yeah, absolutely, that
true.
would be great, yeah. But one thing about the Muslims is that it's the human life is very sacred. So if the person who's sick and the only antibiotic is twice a day or 3 times a day, then it is their religious obligation to take care of themselves versus the fasting. They could make the fasting up later.
Yeah. Okay. I've got some interesting postings over here about what new groups may be lifting their head to get attention and diversity, autism, ADHD. Anybody else have any? Mark.
Yeah, this is kind of counterintuitive, but it's a demand that is actually appearing right now, and it's being ignored by people in our field. And I'm not saying that the demand is right or appropriate, just that it exists. That statistically, when surveys are done, a lot of white people think that they are being discriminated against. And so the demand exists for people who answer those kinds of surveys to be responded to, and instead we in this field pretty much wholesomely ignore them when they say things like that.
Yep.
I would argue though that I think there's a reason why some people ignore some of those systems, because all the systems here show that for the most part, whites are not being discriminated. All the index in this country shows that as far as healthcare, life expectancy, educational level, all those environmental issues as well, that people of color, particularly Black and brown people, are people who suffer disproportionately from those that are on the short end of the stick. No evidence shows. Now, you're in that sort of class that come into play. This is not to say because the poor white people don't have a hard time, or properly that you have had a hard scrabble life, or you haven't had to work hard for your living, but you still do have that white skin privilege, and there is that opportunity there as well. You're still given that advantage. Even poor white people still benefit from white privilege in this country, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, I just want to point out, Elwood, that what you just did was precisely what we were talking about earlier. And that is that when I said something, that wasn't in the mainstream, you immediately shut me down on the basis of facts and evidence. Now, your facts and evidence are correct, but nevertheless, we're in the perception business. And this is the perception of a lot of people.
Right.
And so to walk away from that perception is to devalue those people's feelings. And, much as I don't particularly approve of a lot of that, nevertheless, they are still people, and many of us white people are the ones who possess power, right? Mm-hmm. And so to ignore the predominant group that possesses power is just going to cement the existing power structure. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Omar Wasso, an academic at Princeton, has done studies on this about demonstrations. And what he's found is when demonstrations in the street move away from being completely peaceful, they tend to drive white voters to the right. And so we are never going to solve the racial problems in the United States if we keep driving people apart?
You know, I don't know about driving people apart. I think it has to do with like how we talk, how you know, how we address the situation. I mean, on the one hand, like, you know, you have white people complaining and saying, oh, you know, like, I don't know, there's like some statistics like 60% or something like that, or 80% or whatever of white people think that white people are discriminated against more than black people. I mean, I think we have to definitely have to dispute those facts. And when I like talk about privilege, I let people know, go, you know, there's all different kinds of privilege. And there's economic privilege, and I think that we need to validate different kinds of privilege. I said, and at the same time, we need to look at which privilege is most prevalent. And I said, you know, different times, maybe different privileges are more prevalent. I said, but right now, we do need to look at privileges around white skin. It's like when people talk about like all lives matter. And I always go, yeah, you're right. You know what? All lives do matter. So if all lives matter, we need to look at whose lives are not mattering. The people's lives who are not mattering right now are black people. So therefore, if you say all lives matter, you can't say all lives matter if you don't say black lives matter. So I think it's the way that we frame the conversation. And I just want to say something about faith. I think that that's really important, because now we do have a lot of people, at least like in a lot of organizations I'm in, people talk about faith. They say, oh yeah, faith is always so important. But the reality is they're only talking about one faith, you know. And so I agree with Soumaya. I think it's really important to be able to look at all the different faiths and what it means in terms of inclusion. Because just because you say faith, you know, faith is important, but it's only your faith, you know, it's only like a majority faith, then you're saying that we don't matter, you know. And it's the same thing when white people just want to insist that white people are being discriminated against, then we're saying that other people are not being discriminated against, which is obviously not true.
Thank you, Simma. We're getting toward the end of our time, so interesting stuff has come up in the chat room. You mentioned immigrants have not been part of our discussion. Immigrants as a group.
Old people.
There are, I think, the challenge for diversity is which groups do we attend to, focus on, discuss, and even in our discussion here, the experts, the panel, myself, Deborah, we hit some rough points in our discussion. So I think we see it's not easy to have diversity discussions. So we got final two things as we're talking today. First of all, I want to give a challenge to the five panelists. After we turn to Deborah, the question I warned you at the beginning, here it is. A future president of the United States names you to be her diversity advisor. What would be the first recommendation that you would make? I use her on purpose. I wanted to get away from the current election. We're going to come back to that. But before that, we want to turn to the birthday girl. Deborah Levine turned 21 today. She gets to drink. And talk a little bit about the American Diversity Report before we get to the final go around with the panel.
Yes, I'm 21, several times 21, and it is my birthday, and it is truly wonderful to have this birthday party. I mean, town hall, and because the issue of diversity is so close to my heart. It really is. It always has been since I grew up as the only Jewish little girl on the island of Bermuda. It's just who I am. So if I were, and if I may answer this question about being the advisor to the president, whoever she may be, I would like to say to her, right, that the major people in your office, right, count the people at the top. So think about who you're going to put in the cabinet, who you're going to have as your communications director, who you are going to rely on in terms of Secret Service, CIA, all of these things. And think about those who may be, and I'm going to say this because I am one, be the introverts, and we haven't talked about that. The introverts who are sitting back and probably know everything, right? And have not said a whole lot. But if you tap them, you will have a diverse group that will be so dynamic and unusual. And maybe it's time for the introverts to have their say.
That's an excellent point, because I see that in my classes. I do that a lot of times. That's why I call on students directly. And it's the students a lot of times who may be quiet and stuff. They'll come out with they may not speak all that much, but they have a very, very profound comment, or they make a very, very interesting comment. And then the conversation just goes to another level, because then, oh, yeah. So I think it's very important to tap on those individuals, because they may be reluctant to speak. But I think a lot of times they're introverts, as you said, and extroverts, but introverts who do possess those vital ingredients that can certainly enhance an organization.
So Elwood, you got a recommendation for the president and the future president?
I love how you, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. What Deborah said, I think Deborah made some very, very excellent points there. But yes, who's going to be your communication director? Who's going to be your HUD director? Who's going to be your Surgeon General? Who's going to be those areas? I think they're going to really tap into the lives of many, many Americans. Whether it's the Surgeon General, it's going to do certainly health issues, housing. I think that's very, very crucial. There's going to be an effort to make sure that adequate housing, and look at these issues that are facing, environmental. Who's going to be your Interior Secretary? The issues that facing the environment. The Education Secretary. And that's another whole comment within this class. That's another whole panel within itself. I think right now we have one Secretary of Education. And I think that is absolutely just not a good idea. I think it's ridiculous. How on earth one Secretary of Education is going to be able to address the issues facing kindergarten, K through 12, preschool, as opposed to law, medical, professional schools? My belief would be, as a president, what I would do is primarily establish, with Congress, obviously have congressional approval, but I would certainly have a Secretary of Education, but I'd also have Deputy Secretaries of Education. You're responsible for K through 8. You're responsible for secondary education. You're responsible for college and professional education. You're responsible for, that way, and education disability in that sense. And I think that way, it'll be far more effective than really, because you saw that with even President Obama's previous secretary, Arne Duncan. He was but it was clear K through 12 was where his interests were. He couldn't even talk really that much about higher education or post-secondary education. And that's why, and I think you have to have people with more expertise in those particular areas. So I think those are going to be crucial. Those are crucial, like housing, education, healthcare, the judicial system. Certainly people, who are looking at the judicial system, who's going to be looking, court appointees, look who's at the federal level. We're seeing it right now with the Trump administration. I think people on the left in particular have ignored the really, really fundamentals. People on the right who may not always, and some people on the left may not always have the best intentions, but they've played the long game. They've looked at the powers of the courts. And they took that from people in the 60s. They saw the victories that the left had with Martin Luther King Jr. and others, and the powers that they had were using the courts with the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. So the right basically took a playbook from the left, and they realized the court importances of judicial appointments are very, very highly important, because they can also implement, policies that can really transform a nation for a generation.
Okay. We have others who want to advise. Mark?
Yeah, I think it's a classic strategic planning problem where you ask, what should you stop doing? What should you start doing? What do you do more of? What do you do less of? I think one of the first things that has to be done is to rescind a lot of the bad executive orders, guidance documents, and policies that the Trump administration put in place. His administration has put a lot of bad things in place, and the plug needs to be pulled on them right away.
Okay. Simma?
Well,
Joseph.
Okay. If I were to address or rather advise the secretary, the president, I might add, based on your question, I would state to the person that we have a systemic problem and we need to come up with a systemic solution. And having said that, we mean translating it into action, will mean that all the secretaries, all her cabinet members ought to be trained first and foremost. Because there's a book that says you cannot teach what you don't know. So upon training them on the crucial need of diversity, I would also make it clear that it's not going to be a quick solution. So these secretaries or her cabinet secretaries should also be made to understand that it's going to be a systemic act. So after the secretary may have been trained, they have to look at their functional leaders, train those functional leaders, train the people who report to them, and hold them accountable based on the specific things they want to deal with. I will tell the president to ensure that at the end of what she does, this nation will be united. There should be nothing like isms anymore.
Okay.
So if the person adheres to those practices, as I indicated, they could go through the transformation process, because we already know that even the secretary, or rather the president, I don't know how she may have been social cultured. She has her own view, but I will advise her to engage more, learn more, so that she could be able to communicate with those cabinet secretaries and hold them accountable for issue of diversity. And she may have to underscore that it's one of the most national issue they have to address. So by the end of her administration, that issue should be all over. It should be done. That these discriminatory practices here and there, as one of my friends said, he said that there are two reactions. When something happens, some people respond. And they respond because they're not directly impacted. And on the other hand, when people who are impacted react, they react to the issue. So there's difference between reacting and responding. Responding could be in passing, but reaction is because you've sustained some pain as a result of it. That's what I will advise the president to do.
Good advice. So now let's, Simma.
Okay, what I would say very quickly is that I would look at the president, I'd look at myself, and I'd say, you know what, we're two women, and here I am, like I'm a white, Jewish, 70-year-old lesbian woman, and so I have my perspective, and the president has their perspective, but we need to get a whole bunch more perspectives. And I would say, let's get, before we appoint anybody, let's just get like a good diverse group of people that represent a lot of different backgrounds and interests, and we sit down, and then we could sit down together, and then we can make those recommendations for all the different cabinet positions and everything else that has to happen, because I think that we need a diverse group of people to come up with a strategy for DEI across the country.
Okay, and Soumaya?
All right, my take is, Madam President, I'm so glad you're president, so exciting. Would strongly suggest getting reputable, experienced people that reflect the diversity of our country, and making sure that Madam President walks the walk and shows the whole country how diversity, equity, and inclusion is done.
Great.
Very good.
Well, thank you very much, panelists. You've been terrific. Deborah, do you have any final words?
I just want to thank everyone for their amazing genius in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and for sharing it tonight. Thank you for making my birthday so memorable. I really love you all, and thank you for all of you who have joined us today. And I hope that you will become part of the American Diversity Report family, readership, contributors. We all have different diverse views, and I would love to hear more of them and see more of them, read more of them. So let's hear from you all after this wonderful event tonight.
Wonderful.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
All right, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. It's been good. All right.
A pleasure. Take care and
All
stay
right.
Take care.
All right.
Anybody left? Where is it? Oh, okay.
Well, thank you, folks.
Yeah.
That was lively.
Stop recording, right?
Hmm?
Thank you. Thank you for including me in this.